What's up and welcome back. I'm John Stark from MacTheMovieGuy.com, your favorite blind film critic, and today we're going to talk about The Commandant's Shadow. This is currently available on Max with audio description. It is being submitted for consideration for awards, and I think it's going to be a major player this awards season. So we'll talk about it. This is a documentary that is about World War II and sort of the fallout of World War II, specifically following different people exploring familiar connections to concentration camps. And probably one of the most profound ways that I've seen in a long time, that sort of like generational connection. And this crew has taken the idea of interviewing and following the son of Rudolf Hess, who was the commandant of Auschwitz. He wrote a book. He was one of the few people who actually admitted to what was happening at Auschwitz. And basically, it's his life that is featured in the zone of interest. And they even mention why that area is called the zone of interest around Auschwitz, and even give sort of context if you saw the zone of interest last year. But you can tell that a lot of what the zone of interest was pulled from was from this experience. So this is the son of Hess, and he's now considerably up there in age. He also has a sister, but we don't necessarily follow her. We just kind of visit her in the documentary and talk about sort of how they feel. What was their experience like growing up right outside of Auschwitz? Did they know? Were they aware? What did they feel like today? And then downstream from that is also the grandson of the commandant, who's also living in the shadow, and he brings up a lot of stuff, like a Bible quote about, that the sins of the father, and like how many generations down. I guess in the Bible quote it says, so he feels like because the sins of his grandfather, like his grandfather was the commandant of Auschwitz. The brainchild that created this massive death camp that murdered millions of Jews, that he is also living with this incredibly dark shadow that he really has no control over. He didn't even live through the experience the way his father did. And it poses a lot of interesting questions from this side about people who are tangentially connected to somebody terrible who did absolutely horrific things, and what it's like to have to follow that. You always hear about these people who are killers and they have friends and family members, and most of the time we're not interested in hearing from them. But there's something to be said about somebody who's a little child at the time. And it's like, it's hard to blame little kids for their parents, especially when their parent is like a huge SS officer. So I think that's why he has been given sort of this little branch of grace in life coming out of this, even though I'm sure a lot of people hate him, even though he was a kid at the time. And there's a question of, what did you know? What did you remember? How could you possibly not know? And they explore that in great detail and ask him and his sister, and you get two totally different answers, by the way. But at the same time, what we also explore is there was a survivor of Auschwitz, and she's still alive, and she survived by being able to play an instrument. and they had people. Uh, Hess actually had an orchestra, like a little orchestra that had to play a death march all the time for this stuff. Like, it was not just for the the extermination moments, but also, I guess, as entertainment for the Nazis. So she survived because she could play an instrument. And when she got out, she was very disconnected, and um, her life completely changed. She moved away from Germany, and she did end up having a family, but her daughter, who is one of the sort of the central characters here, who is the contemporary of Hess's son, who's the grandson's contemporary. I forgot everybody's names. I'm sorry. Um, she wants to explore her history, and she wants to sort of have a little bit of a conversation with her mom about anything that she's willing to talk, because it was always off limits when she was a child to talk about that kind of thing. But her mom was always like at a distance. It was not quite always there. But her mom, also she got a job and had to put food on the table. It's so weird to think about that. It's so weird to think about, like, I feel like if you survived Auschwitz, like, something should have been set up so you never needed to work again. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like that was it, done. Here's your pension. Like, the idea that anybody needed to ever work or do anything after that, it's like, how, you survived such a terrible thing. I'm so sorry you ever had to, like, get a job. It's insane. And part of the reason that her mother's even willing to talk is because she sees that anti-Semitism is still a thing, and she's afraid of it and afraid of it recurring. And sort of I don't want to say funny thing, but most people would find this to be at least interesting, if not quirky, is that her family didn't even practice the Jewish faith. They were only identified as Jewish, but her father actually fought for Germany in World War One. Won an Iron Cross. Was a decorated soldier, and it wasn't until World War II and the onset of World War II that they were stripped of their German citizenship, and I guess his father was no longer recognized as a soldier. It really begs the question of how are they tracking people? These people weren't practicing the faith, and man, they really were. Hitler was really into this blonde hair, blue eyed thing, because when you have somebody who's literally part of your squad and you kick them out because even though they're not practicing anything, talk about being able to really understand sort of ethnic lineage in a way that's fucking scary. Because her dad was like 2 steps away from being a Nazi, if you think about it that way. If her family had been given, I don't know, special disposition because her father fought, her father could have been, I don't know, an officer or something at that point. There was enough time between World War I and World War II that I'm sure that he was considerably older, but there's no reason that he couldn't have been an officer. These are weird things to think about, but it's the kind of stuff that she lives with every day. Are these thoughts of the fact that her father fought for Germany and then was persecuted by Germany, and that they had their citizenship even stripped, even though he was awarded this Iron Cross. Very odd. But one hell of a powerful film. This is just like a breathless documentary that I felt very almost like something I shouldn't be a part of, but also at the same time I felt very grateful to have been given the opportunity to see something like this, to experience this. At the same time, there's still the weight of what happened in order to create a documentary, in order for people to have this experience. And yes, like I would erase this film in a hot second if it meant none of that ever happened. So we never needed to make a documentary about it. But since it did, the fact that these two end up sort of converging, they converge at Auschwitz and they have sort of this experience, and it's Hess's first time back since being a kid, and he's never actually walked the sort of Auschwitz memorial that's still standing. And on the other side, you have the survivor that, while her mother doesn't go with her to Auschwitz, they do end up meeting. The mother, who was in Auschwitz, ends up meeting Hess's the grandson. Hess and his Hess and his son, the grandson. And all of them end up talking about this experience and this generational trauma, and it's a hell of a fucking documentary. And it's one where you get the right people, and that's what makes it that's what makes the documentary powerful, is when you're able to interview the right people with the right history at the right moment in time. And when these people are willing to travel to Auschwitz and stand there and explore this history, it's just so absolutely profound. I can't imagine that there's 5 documentaries that can knock this out of. This has to get the Oscar shortlist. If it's legitimately in the. I noticed an FYC campaign was running for it, and I don't. HBO releases a lot of documentaries. I didn't even know what it was about, and I did see that it passed on Max. And when I saw there was an FYC campaign for it, I was like, oh well, I should watch it in case. Oh my God, I'm so glad I watched this, because this is one of the best things I've seen this year. But in that way, in a very similar way to a lot of films that I've seen like this, where it's like incredibly profound and I never need to see it again because it's so hard to sit through. 20 Days of Mariupol. I can't imagine there are people who are watching that over and over and over and over again. All Quiet on the Western Front was my favorite film of 2022. It'd be incredibly brutal to continue to sit through that over and over again. So Zone of Interest is a brilliant film. Another film that would be a really hard watch to watch multiple times. So some of these films are just, they take a lot out of you, and then you feel guilty for saying that, because you're like, the reason that documentary exists is because it took a lot more out of a lot more people to get to that point. So please watch this. We owe it to the world, I think, in many ways, to have this conversation. And anti-Semitism is still a thing, and it still is. And there's some excellent pull quotes from things that they say in this. There's one about how the Jews were God's people, or God's chosen people, or something like that. And her response back to it is why us? Why, choose someone else for once? What good has it done us? And she quoted a psalm after that that was sort of perfect to wrap up her thoughts. And I understand that feeling. I can understand why she feels like, what is the benefit here? You say we're God's chosen people, but what does that mean? Because it certainly doesn't feel like it. It certainly doesn't. Like, she's gained nothing from that. I would say the only time that I had any sort of problem with it was in the same scene when he was talking about sort of that generational trauma being brought down through the quote of the sins of the father. will be inherited by, and then like 2 or 3 generations down. And then he's like, you know, preaching at that point in an actual church that he has in Germany for like expats. And when he starts bleeding it into Christianity and then saying, well, that's why, you know, Jesus died for our sins and accept him as the Lord. And, you know, and like this is a documentary about the Jewish people and also largely like the Jewish faith. And to say then that the salvation is to then move into Christianity kind of felt like a little bit of maybe he was missing the point and missing the vibe here, that the salvation shouldn't be to go join another religion, you know, to accept you know, that we have sins to atone for, and the only way to atone for them is by becoming Christian, you Jews. But that's kind of what it feels like he's saying at the same time is, well, there were sins, but then Jesus came, and well, that's the difference between Christianity and Judaism. One believes he's the son of God, and the other believes he's just a prophet. So, and is not the central focus of their religion. So to use one to justify the other did feel like it was out of place in this film. And it was very odd that the filmmakers left that in there. But at the same time, you do you know? It did kind of leave me with a little bit of I winced. I was like a little bit, I followed his train of thought and I was like, oh God. Like I don't have a problem with it. Like he can say it all he wants, but the fact that it was included in this documentary, the fact that he knew he was being filmed for this documentary, the fact that was the conclusion, it's like maybe when we're exploring generational trauma of Jews being murdered by, like 1 million Jews being murdered by this one dude, the answer shouldn't be, have you accepted Christ into your life? Maybe. Okay, so to talk about the audio description, and I talked about the one thing that bothered me in the entire film, which I actually think this is one of those rare times where I would say less is more, because a lot of this, there's so much weight in these moments. There's so much weight in silence. This is a film that lingers, it holds, it drags. And in order to do that, the audio description has to allow silence to happen. It has to allow somebody to say something and the resonance of that instead of using that gap. So what I really appreciated about the audio description was that it was not over described. You may feel like it's under described, but when you think about what it is that they're describing, do we need that? Or is it more important to hear the emotional weight and to let what somebody just said and the impact of that sit instead of just immediately jumping in, you know, because likely what's happening is that is holding on their face anyway. And there isn't really anything else to describe, but then to like jump in with maybe like facial expressions and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, you could fill every single block of space, but there are plenty of times where they have empty space and they leave it empty. And I think that was a smart choice for this documentary, which is rare because most of the times it's not. It is the wrong choice. But when there's so much depth here, when there's so much heaviness and weight in the story and in the narrative, and then and it feels like there's so many profound things that are happening and being said, that the best way to do that is to just let it lay, let it sit, and let it breathe. So I highly recommend The Commandant's Shadow, despite that one thing. And also Hess's sister. I have thoughts. She's also dying of cancer, but I definitely have thoughts. I don't want to, just in case you watch this and think like, wow, he dodged that. I do have thoughts, but she's presented in the documentary of dying of cancer at the time. And based on the time it takes to produce a film and then release a film, she's probably dead. So I'm just gonna leave that. Do I agree with what she says? I do not. But that's how I feel about um, processing somebody in that moment. So one of the best documentaries of the year, hands down. Commandant Shadow is verging on an A+ because I it's one of those things where it's like I can't really fault it, because even the guy said it. You're just showing his quote. It's not like narratively there's something that's broken, and not everything people say has to be perfect. It just made me look at that guy a little bit differently when he's talking about his own generational trauma versus the way that his contemporary looks at hers. So it verges on like an A+, but I don't usually give that on a first time watch, if ever. So yeah, this is one of the best films I've seen this year, and will stick with me for a long time. So please watch it. It's on Max. So if you have Max, you can just watch it with no additional cost to yourself. Thank you for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I'll see you guys on the other side.